Today we are looking at a case from the first part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Mary Cecilia Rogers was born in the small town of Lyme in Connecticut in the year 1820. Her father died when she was young, leaving Mary's mother named Phoebe a widow for the second time. She had previously been married to a wealthy merchant, and together they had 5 children, although only 2 survived infancy. On the death of her second husband in 1837, Mrs. Rogers, and by now her 17-year-old daughter Mary, moved to live with Mrs. Rogers' sister in New York. It was a difficult time for her, as she needed to earn money in order to keep herself and her daughter. And although things in America were changing, in the mid-1830s, less than 10% of women held jobs outside the home. Mary grew into a beautiful young lady. Not only was she very attractive, she also conducted herself in a very dignified manner, so it was not a surprise to those who knew her that young gentlemen would always try to make her acquaintance. She was approached by a cigar store owner named Mr. John Anderson. He asked her if she would come and work for him at his store. At first, Mary's mother did not agree to her daughter working in the store, especially as the customers were predominantly men, but eventually she agreed, and soon Mary was earning a generous wage. Mr. Anderson had wanted to employ Mary, as he believed that having such a beautiful young lady working in his cigar store would bring in more customers. However, he did not realise just how successful the store would become. Customers flocked there, all in the hope of seeing Mary. One gentleman became so taken by her beauty that he wrote a poem which told of her heaven-like smile and her star-like eyes. The poem was published in the New York Herald. Following this, even more gentlemen visited Mr. Anderson's cigar store. These included notable literary figures such as James Fenimore Cooper, Washington Irving, and Fitz Greene Halleck. However, the customers who frequented Mr. Anderson's store were shocked when in October 1838, Mary suddenly went missing. Her disappearance was reported in the newspapers, one of which claimed that her mother, Mrs. Phoebe Rogers, had found a suicide note written by Mary, and on reading the notes, the local coroner had concluded that she had a fixed and unalterable determination to destroy herself. The disappearance was causing much discussion amongst the gentlemen of New York, but a few days later, Miss Mary Rogers turned up alive and well, having apparently only been to see an aunt who lived outside the city. Some newspapers described the whole event as a hoax designed by Mr. Anderson to get even more publicity for his cigar store. Strangely, after she returned, her demeanour changed. She was no longer the happy young lady who assisted customers with a nice smile. She still worked hard, but she seemed more reserved and at times quite solemn. Rumours had started to circulate that she had been seen with a tall and handsome gentleman when she had allegedly been visiting her aunt. By now, Mrs. Phoebe Rogers had taken a lease on a boarding house, so Mary left the employment of Mr. Anderson and instead worked alongside her mother. Of course, many of the boarders who came to stay were captivated by Mary. A young law clerk named Alfred Crommelin was particularly taken by her. Unfortunately for Alfred, Mary had already fallen for another young gentleman who boarded there, named Mr. Daniel Payne. He had asked for her hand in marriage, and although he was not wealthy, he was handsome and charming, and openly spoke of his true affection for her. Unfortunately, Mary's mother was not happy with the match. Although she thought Daniel Payne to be a kind-hearted young man, he was employed as a cork cutter, and she had wanted her daughter to marry into a more elite social circle. She knew that Mary had many amaras, and hoped that she would marry a gentleman who would be able to improve the family's circumstances. On Sunday, the 25th of July, 1841, Mary went to church. After the service, she told her fiancé that she would be going to visit a relative named Mrs. Downing, who lived in Bleecker Street. Mr. Payne replied that he would come to Mrs. Downing's house later that evening to accompany her home. However, as the day progressed, an unabating storm descended on New York. The rain was so strong that Daniel Payne considered that Mary would not want to travel back, so did not go to meet her. The next day the storm had cleared, and the sun was shining. Mrs. Rogers patiently waited for her daughter to come home, but as the day progressed, Mary did not return. When Mary's fiancé, Daniel Payne, arrived at the boarding house from work, Mrs. Rogers told him that Mary was still not home. By now she had become very anxious as to her daughter's whereabouts. Mr. Payne immediately made his way to Bleecker Street, the home of Mrs. Downing. When he arrived, Mrs. Downing was surprised by his visit. She told the young man that she had not seen Mary and had not been expecting to see her the previous day. She had received no word from her for a while and had no idea where she might be. Mr. Payne left the house of Mrs. Downing and walked along Broadway. He asked anyone who knew Mary if they had seen her, but no one had. He then returned to the lodging house and told Mrs. Rogers that Mary was nowhere to be found. Now both very concerned, they informed the police that Miss Mary Rogers was missing. 3 days later, on Wednesday the 28th of July, 3 men who were out walking near Civil's Cave in Hoboken spotted something floating in the river. They decided to try and find out what exactly it was, so got into a rowing boat and rowed towards it. They were, however, quite horrified when they discovered that the mysterious object was in fact the body of a young woman. The men managed to bring the body onto the boat and take it to shore. Although the area was never usually frequented by many people, news of the body found in the river soon spread, and a large crowd gathered to see it. One of those was Mr. Alfred Crommelin, and he confirmed that the young lady was Miss Mary Rogers. The body was taken away to be examined by the pathologist, who carried out an autopsy. He soon discovered that Mary's face had been beaten. There was also a cord fastened around her waist, and a piece of lace, evidently torn from her dress, was tied around her neck. There were cord marks on her wrists, and it seemed that she had been sexually assaulted. Dr. Cook concluded that Miss Mary Rogers was murdered and that her clothes had been removed during the assault. She was then killed and dressed before being placed in the water. He said that the knot tied on the bonnet was rudimentary and one that would be tied by a sailor rather than a delicate young lady. Again, Mary Rogers became headline news across New York, with stories of the beautiful cigar girl who had been so brutally murdered appearing in every newspaper. Of course, the press speculated on who may have been responsible for this most terrible of crimes. Her fiancé Daniel Payne seemed the obvious suspect. It was suggested that as Mrs. Phoebe Rogers did not think him good enough for her daughter, he may have killed Mary in a rage. Some newspapers thought it more likely that Mary had been the victim of a random attack. The police investigation was slow. At the time, New York was a rapidly growing city, with a population of 320,000. However, as the population increased, the police force had not, and the city was served by just one night watch, 100 city marshals, 31 constables, and 51 police officers. Daniel Payne had told them that on Sunday the 25th of July, he had been drinking for most of the day and had also been with relatives. His alibi was confirmed by a number of people. The police did arrest other suspects, all of who had alibis. Mr. Joseph Morse had lodged for a time at the boarding house on Nassau Street and had previously been known to police. He gave them a somewhat contradictory statement, but officers were unable to find any evidence against him. Another previous lodger of Mrs. Phoebe Rogers' boarding house was a sailor, but again, the police could find no evidence against him, other than that he was a sailor, so knew how to tie sailors' knots, and the pathologist had said that the assailant or assailants may have been sailors. The press continued to report on the case, but as no new suspects were uncovered, it was more a mixture of speculation and hearsay, and articles outlining how the police had not conducted a particularly thorough investigation. In September, the location of the place where Miss Rogers had been attacked was discovered, in the woods around Hoboken. Teenagers found a silk scarf, a petticoat, a parasol, and a lady's handkerchief with the initials M.R. They informed their mother, a lady named Mrs. Frederica Loss, who ran a nearby tavern called Nick Moore's House. Mrs. Loss informed the police of the discovery, and when they questioned her, she said that she remembered that a young couple had dined at the tavern on the 25th of July, and that in the evening she had heard what she thought was a woman scream, but after going to the door to look out, had concluded that the noise must have been from an animal. She was quite certain, however, that the young lady she had served was the murdered girl, Miss Mary Rogers. The police inspected the place, where it was believed that Miss Rogers had been attacked. They found that the long grass had been trodden down, and there was evidence that a struggle had occurred. There was also a sort of track leading to the river that may have been made by dragging the young lady's body through the grass. When the articles were shown to Mary's mother, she confirmed that they had all belonged to her daughter. The police did their best to try and find out the identity of the mysterious man who Mary had been seen with at Mrs. Loss's tavern. Rumours circulated that he was a naval officer but there was no evidence to support this. They believed that Mary's mother, Mrs. Phoebe Rogers, knew far more about her daughter's secret Amara than she was willing to admit. Although Daniel Payne had an alibi for the day that Mary was murdered, there were many who still considered him to be a suspect. Since her death, he had started drinking heavily and had even claimed that he had seen her ghost. On the 7th of October, he travelled on the ferry to Hoboken. He stopped at Mrs. Loss's tavern, had a few drinks, and then proceeded to the place where Mary had been killed. He sat on the grass, where he drank laudanum, and died. He left a note in his pocket which read, "May God forgive me for my misspent life." Some people concluded that this was undoubtedly an admission that he had indeed murdered his fiancée, Miss Mary Rogers, while others thought that he had been driven mad by despair. The police had no more suspects, and the case of the beautiful cigar girl was no longer appearing in the newspapers. The people of New York had moved on to other stories. There were still the occasional theories, mainly regarding how Mrs. Loss had come to be in possession of the items that had belonged to Mary. Some believed that her teenage children had found the items shortly after the body had been discovered, but Mrs. Loss chose to hold on to them until the police announced a reward for information that could lead to a conviction in the case. This, however, was all just speculation, and there was no conclusive evidence to support it. A year later, when the talk of the murder of Mary Rogers had long since ceased, a freak accident reignited the interest in the case, as Mrs. Loss was accidentally shot by one of her sons. As she lay in her bed in a very bad way, she sent for a New Jersey judge, as she said that she had something to confess. When Judge Merritt arrived, Mrs. Loss told him a strange and macabre tale. She said that Miss Mary Rogers came to her tavern on Sunday the 25th of July 1841 with a tall, handsome doctor. Mary was with child, and the doctor had arranged to perform a termination. However, there were complications, which resulted in the young lady's death. Unaware of what to do, the doctor quickly departed, leaving Mrs. Loss with the responsibility of disposing of the body. She said that her sons took the body to the river and then placed the deceased young lady's petticoat and other items in a nearby pond, before deciding that they should be taken somewhere more secluded, so scattered them in the dense thicket of the woods near Sybil's cave. She said that she did not know the name of the doctor. Shortly after this confession, Mrs. Loss died. Some newspapers accepted the confession and announced that the mystery surrounding the death of the beautiful cigar girl had been solved. The newspaper, the Tribune, wrote, "Thus has this fearful mystery, which has struck fear and terror to so many hearts, has been at last explained by circumstances in which no one can fail to perceive a providential agency." The police, however, were not convinced. Mrs. Loss's deathbed confession contradicted some of the known facts about the death of Miss Rogers. When the body was discovered, there were marks on the young lady's neck. Her wrists had been tied, and the coroner had reported that she had died due to strangulation. There was no mention that the cause of her demise was a botched termination. Newspapers were quick to try and identify the mysterious doctor. However, instead of the tall gentleman, many speculated that the person responsible was not a man, but a woman who had quite a reputation of helping unmarried young ladies quietly terminate an unwanted pregnancy. Her name was Madame Restell, and she was well known to Judge Henry Merritt. She was originally from England and had come to New York in 1831 when she was 19 years old. She had no real medical training, but had become infamous for providing assistance to young women, mainly those from the higher social circles. Not only did she conduct terminations, she also provided powders and pills that she claimed either worked as a contraceptive or as a method of terminating a pregnancy. Some newspapers also brought up the time in 1838 when Miss Mary Rogers went missing. It was suggested that she may have disappeared for no other reason other than to terminate a pregnancy, and that is why her disappearance was so shrouded in mystery. There was no evidence to support any of this, and no proof ever emerged that Madame Restell had ever met Mary, or that Mary had ever been pregnant. The coroner's course of death had not changed. For a while, however, it did regenerate the public's interest in the case. Mrs. Loss's children were questioned, but they both said that the deathbed statement made by their mother was not true, and was just a tale invented by a dying woman. At the end of 1842, Edgar Allan Poe had a story published titled The Mystery of Mary Rogers. This retold the case of the death of Mary Rogers, but instead of New York, he made the location for the story Paris in France. Once this was published, people again started to speculate about who could have been responsible for the murder. Some believed that Mrs. Loss's deathbed confession was probably true. Others thought Daniel Payne to be guilty. Suspects also mentioned included the young law clerk Alfred Crommelin, who had vied for Mary's affections. There was even the suggestion that her employer, Mr. John Anderson, may have been responsible. But despite all the theories, gossip and hearsay, exactly why and how the beautiful cigar girl, Miss Mary Cecilia Rogers, died remains a mystery to this day. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. If you would like to know more about the life of Madame Restel, it was covered last week by the brilliant channel Forgotten Lives, and there is a link to the video in the description. And I hope to see you all again next Monday for another brief case